Well, I find myself in a rare situation where I'm stuck between two active negotiators. I've never negotiated in my life, but here are two negotiators, and I'm sort of stuck between them as an academic. Employing the key word for this conference, which was trust, I trust that everyone who remained here and who joined us and who remained until now has found this conference of some interest and is now eagerly waiting to hear what former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert has to say, who, as I just mentioned, as an active negotiator, knows one or two things about establishing and maintaining trust with his Palestinian counterparts. About 2 months ago, I've been given the impossible task of trying to sum up this conference. 2 months ago, it seemed a long time away, so I foolishly accepted, and I'm now faced with an impossible task to say a few concluding, or to give a few concluding remarks. It's obviously quite impossible to sum up the many multidisciplinary lessons and insights provided by all the speakers. All what has been said will find its way into a volume on trust to be published by our host, the Steinmetz Center. So before the academic outlook yields to the political perspective by Prime Minister Olmert, let me make just a few brief observations in conclusion. I think that the most provocative question that ran through the whole conference, and for me this was quite a surprise, I don't know about some of you here, was that we took it for granted even before the conference. We had, as some of you have heard, we had a long, year-long or 18 months long workshop on trust. We took it somehow for granted. I can only talk for myself, but I think this includes others, that trust is an essential ingredient of conflict resolution. This was a working hypothesis. Hardly anybody refuted it or tried to disagree. The theme that ran through most of the presentations here was that here a question mark should be placed. Is trust really essential for conflict resolution? Is it essential? Is it beneficial? Is it irrelevant? Or maybe, as has been suggested this morning, is it detrimental? This is a question which I think we have not really agreed on an answer. I think the jury is still out. The jury is still out, but this is really places some groundwork for future conferences and certainly in thought. I do think that we have a fair degree of agreement now on what trust actually means and what it consists of. Of course, there are many definitions and many ingredients and definitions that have been offered here from this podium, but essentially I think we speak of a state of mind comprising the intention to accept risk. This state of mind is based upon positive intentions, or positive expectations of the intentions of another, of somebody else, of some other collective or some other entity. Of course, for trust to become relevant, you need an element of risk. This has been mentioned here repeatedly. Trust is not needed if actions can be undertaken with complete certainty and no risk. Risk is the perceived probability of loss. It creates the need for trust, which in turn leads to risk-taking. On the other hand, risk-taking reinforces a sense of trust when the expected behavior of the other materializes. The second major component of trust we learned about is interdependence, where the interests of one party cannot be achieved without reliance upon the other. Clearly, trust can take many shapes or a combination thereof. I shall mention just three of the major forms of trust that I sort of identified here. The first one, I may perhaps add another word, one of the dichotomies which sort of surfaced here was a dichotomy between trust-based conflict resolution and mutual interest based. And this was presented here by some speakers as a sort of dichotomy. Well, I think we can sort of combine or integrate the two. I called it deterrence-based trust, which means that one side is convinced that the other will be trustworthy because of the costly sanctions for breach of trust exceeds any potential benefits from opportunistic behavior. That one side believes that the other side will not breach trust because it's too costly for him. So here you have a mutual interest, a negative mutual interest, but it is still a mutual interest which creates some sort of trust, if you want to call it that. I think that this seems to have been the basis for the recent Geneva understanding between the P5+1 and Iran. This is the first type of trust. The second one has been mentioned quite frequently here, is a calculus-based trust, in which the trustor believes that the trustee intends to perform an action or to refrain from an action because this is beneficial to the latter, to the trustee, to the trustee's own interest. That's a calculus-based interest. And of course there is, and Ron spoke, I think this was the main emphasis in Ron's presentation before, the third type is a relational trust derived from repeated interaction over time between the sides and between individuals representing both sides, which convinced at least them of the credibility, of the reliability and dependability of each one towards the other. I'm really curious to learn from Ehud Ulmert which of these three types of trust or combination thereof he succeeded in achieving or was on the verge of achieving when negotiating with the president of the PA. In this room, it is not necessary to emphasize what a precious commodity trust between adversaries is and what it takes in terms of time and effort to build trust. Nor need we elaborate here on how easily and rapidly trust can decline or break down altogether. Someone compared the breakdown of trust to the loss of virginity. Once it happens, there is hardly a way back, or either. The problem is that you cannot simply decide to trust the other whom you mistrust, even if you think it could provide you with an advantage under the given circumstances. It is simply impossible to just forget past betrayal or perceived injustice committed by the other against you. One scholar described the attempt to re-establish trust that has been betrayed as willing that cannot be willed. Willing that cannot be willed. The best you can hope for is some measure of controlled cooperation, monitored or imposed by a third party. And I think in line with Judith Averbuch's pyramid, I remembered when she talked several years ago, the Canadian Prime Minister apologized to the indigenous Inuits of Canada for depriving them of their land and resources. This statement was later followed by concrete action to rectify the wrongs that have been done. Similar examples were given during this conference from the Northern Ireland and the Croatian experience. The recent celebration of the Lake Mandela story is another case in point. So this got me thinking, naively so perhaps, what would have transpired in terms of rebuilding trust or rebuilding a basis for trust with the Palestinians if Benjamin Netanyahu would stand up in the Knesset in a nationwide primetime speech and instead of the usual blame game would concede that Israel shares, I emphasize shares, not assumes, shares responsibility for the tragic decades-long suffering of the Palestinians under occupation. Such a speech would certainly make headlines in the world media, but would it help overcome deep-rooted mistrust and trust barriers among Palestinians towards Israel's intention just, by the way, as President Sadat's visit did to the Israeli perceptions in 1977 within 48 hours or something like that. Clearly, at the very least, more concrete steps would be needed as a follow-up. Furthermore, and I think this is not less important, how will Israelis react to such a statement? Does a present-day Israeli leader, be it Netanyahu or someone else, enjoy enough social and political capital in his own country, let alone within his own political base, to survive politically from such dramatic move? I suspect that many here, certainly outside this room, would react with great skepticism, or at best with a forgiving smile to such an idea and consider it totally naive. However, just consider for a moment how David Ben-Gurion, barely 10 years after the Holocaust, managed to pass the German restitution law through the Knesset, which implies that in exchange, Israel implicitly recognizes that a new Germany does exist, with all the implications of that, after the Holocaust. Ben-Gurion did this, risking civil strife, but he operated in what was then, unlike today, a high-trust society which provided him with sufficient social and political capital for such decisions. So lastly, on a personal level, I, for one, emerge from this conference not entirely an optimist, but hopefully one day I will be. On behalf, before Dr. Pundak introduces the keynote speaker, I would like, on behalf of all of you, to take this opportunity to thank all the speakers of this conference for their contributions. We learned a lot during those 2 days. I want to thank Shalom Turjeman for his help in bringing Prime Minister Olmert here. And of course, I want to thank the Steinmetz Center, and in particular Moti Tamarkin, Ephraim Lavi, and Eli Alon, and all their co-workers for their initiative and for making this conference possible. Thank you very much.